A group of activists has scored a partial victory in its campaign for the renaming of Faneuil Hall. Thanks to the efforts of the New Democracy Coalition, it's more widely known that the historic meeting place was a gift to the city from a slaveholder, Peter Faneuil. There has also been debate on both sides of the question, but this will soon play out before the council. To tell us about the campaign and why it matters is a spokesperson, Bill Wright. Thank you very much for being with us, Bill.
Thanks for the invitation, Chris.
Bill, first of all, you've been around Boston for a long time. We've heard the name Faneuil Hall all these years. When did this really hit you in the radar screen?
Well, like you at Boston Latin School, we learned about the triangle trade, but we didn't hear much about the role of Boston merchants in that trade. Now with the internet, many things are being revealed. Schools like Georgetown that sold slaves to build parts of their campus, and Yale, et cetera, are trying to make amends for the things that were done in those times. It is ironic to me, and again, thinking about Boston Latin School, that the statue of Samuel Adams stands in front of a building that was paid for by the sale of a slave. And I could imagine that Adams, who of course, is upset anyway that he's just become a beer to most people, and of course we know as governor of Massachusetts as well, is basically insulting that that name still remains now that it's been, revealed that Faneuil was the slave trader.
I think it's not much news to me, or you probably, that there were some slaveholders in the 18th or maybe even the 17th century in Boston, but at the same time, I was thinking for many years that this is just a sort of a sideshow. Not that many people were doing it, but I guess, was it just that, or was this really central to the whole New England economy at that time?
Well, I guess the idea was that the sugar cane from the West Indies was used to make the rum, and the molasses was a disaster. Remember that? The molasses was then sent to Africa, where slaves were picked up and brought to the West Indies, and that triangle continued with the merchants in Boston making lots of money through the sale of human beings. It's interesting that when we were growing up and learning about the slave trade, we heard much about the abolitionists, such as William Lloyd Garrison, and of course what Frederick Douglass did, both in Massachusetts and elsewhere, to advocate for the freedom of slaves. And the 54th Regiment story we knew, but I never heard a word about Boston slave traders.
Why is it important for people to know about this?
Well, it's important that people know. Some people say, are you trying to change history? No, we're amplifying history. We're adding information that was suppressed and not revealed to the public. It's important because, well, first of all, as you know, the mayor was reluctant to hold a public hearing on this matter, and none of the 13 city councilors would put in an order for a hearing. I found it remarkable that neither the Globe nor the Herald took the time to poll the councilors individually as to whether they were in favor of having a hearing, not about changing the name, but just having a hearing. That's basic democracy. But they just, turned a blind eye, and I believe they thought this issue would just go away.
Well, I guess one thing that councilors might have been thinking was that, there are some really determined activists who are talking about this and pushing for it, but they're not seeing huge numbers of people out there calling for it, at least not yet.
Well, most people are busy living their lives, raising their children, educating them, making a living. And there are some people who have the time and taking the time to fight for issues like this. Sometimes people say, well, that's not the biggest thing in the world. Well, symbolically it is. Just as the change of Yawkey Way back to Jersey Street was significant because it showed that when people knew more of the history of Tom Yawkey and that he was from South Carolina and that he had racist views, people decided that that name should change. Now, that was just the person who was a South Carolina racist. In Faneuil's case, this was a person who today would be called a human trafficker.
Bill, of course, one thing you could have, you could change the name of Faneuil Hall to something more broadly acceptable, and we forget about Peter Faneuil. We stop talking about that history. I mean, couldn't that also be one result of this?
Well, if the plaque that's designed by Mayor Walsh and City Hall folks is large enough, people will still be able to see the story and the history of why the name was changed. And Peter Faneuil's name could be in really huge letters. But the other thing about that marketplace is that the Quincy Market apparently has 104 vendors. Not a single one is black or Latino. That's a revelation for a lot of people as well. And you may realize that not very many black Bostonians go to Faneuil Hall Marketplace to purchase things, to go to the restaurants, etc. The black people you see in Faneuil Hall might be tourists who are in town, someone who may be working at one of the shops there, or somebody who is just again a business person in town for a day or two. Residents of Roxbury, Dorchester, and other neighborhoods where black people live in this town do not go to Faneuil Hall because it's also viewed as a hostile area. When you go there, you're not greeted in friendly terms. And that's, people say if you change the name, people won't go there any longer. The names Crispus Attucks and Elizabeth Freeman have been suggested to be either a combination or one of them as the new name. And some people say, well, if it's named for Crispus Attucks, people won't come there. That's totally wrong. More people will come there.
And picture what happens in one of the future years. Is the NAACP holding a national convention here? What about how they see the city and where they're most likely to be looking?
Well, as you know, on February 27th, a number of us went to the city council, and we did a protest requesting a public hearing. The council president, Andrea Campbell, asked us to put the signs down, and Maureen Feeney, a former city councilor who's now the clerk, read some rule 139 or something about not having protests, and they seemed not to recognize that we were doing civil disobedience to demonstrate what democracy really is. As you know, many people have a view, as Ice-T might say, a twisted view, that we work for elected officials. Elected officials work for us, okay? And we have the power to put them in office or take them out of office. So we know that the demonstration we did got a lot of attention, and we believe that some members of the NAACP likely saw that, and that might have helped them decide to choose Boston for next year's convention, recognizing that we need a little help here.
By the way, if you look at a statue of Robert E. Lee, it's hard to escape thinking of that as an endorsement of slavery and not just the Confederacy. With Faneuil Hall, for most of us, for so many years, we didn't even hear about the slavery. We just thought it was some person who was sort of philanthropic and giving something to the city. Is there a difference? Isn't there a difference between those two?
Yes, in the State Street Blue Line station, there's a quote on the wall from Lafayette, General Lafayette, who of course assisted George Washington in the Revolution, and he said that Faneuil Hall should forever stand as a symbol of liberty, etc. The generals in the Confederate Army and the other Southerners who fought in the Civil War against the Union were basically traitors. They had committed treason against the United States government. And those statues weren't there since the 1860s. Those statues were put up in the 50s and 60s even. So that history, that whole enamored feeling about the Confederacy that some people feel was a false notion. These were traitors against the United States of America.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
For the New Democracy Coalition, Bill Wright. We'll have more news in just a moment.